Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining this seminar. My name is John Sutherland. I'm a member of the WA Committee of ER Law, and which is the new name for AMPLA. And I'm very pleased to chair this seminar and this presentation by Steve Shupp about cybersecurity in the resources sector. And I'll introduce Steve shortly, but I just wanted to say a few things. And firstly, ER Law acknowledges the traditional owners of the locations where everyone is today. I'm on Whadjuk Budjar or Noongar country in the southwest of Australia, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. And ER Law is very interested and very excited to present this, because as you can see just here, there are some issues that, as I said, you'll recall, give this a bit of importance and relevance in the resources sector. We'll all recall probably earlier this year the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, and you can see some news on that. But a couple of years back, the one at the bottom, the cyber attack on Hydro, that's Norsk Hydro, one of the largest aluminium producers in the world, and they had a virus that got into their system. And I remember reading about that some of it had to go back to manual operations, and certainly with the shutdowns and the responses, it was I'd read estimated about $70 million just trying to deal with the implications of that. So there's certainly no shortage of importance of this, of understanding this in the resources sector. And if we can go to the next slide, I think we can also see that it's of relevance and of interest outside the resources sector as well. This is the latest issue of Company Director from the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And if you pick that up, you will see a number of articles dealing with cybersecurity, dealing with IT issues, cloud storage in that issue, and then also some of their I guess flags and updates and things to be aware of, certainly bringing it very much to boardrooms and issues of directors and risk within companies. So it's of broad interest. Next slide, we see I've picked up a press release from ASIC last year, and this is the first prosecution for inadequate cybersecurity. Now, probably before half the audience is going looking for their Corps Act and thinking, I didn't know about the cybersecurity arrangements. I should say this is specifically in relation to financial services licensees. So for the resources lawyers, that's maybe why you're not familiar with those provisions. But this is, I looked recently, set for trial in November this year. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And the next slide, we'll see not just keep an eye on this trial, but also keep an eye more generally. And I realise you can't perhaps read a lot of this. This was a discussion paper that the government put out just a couple of months back about strengthening cybersecurity issues in Australia. And you can see sort of their thinking and their setting up of the scene. I'd bring your attention to that bottom box, possible new policies, new areas that they're saying, well, might this be where we should be, what we should be thinking about? And you can see there ideas of standards for large businesses, ideas of clearer legal remedies for consumers, disclosure policies. So it's certainly an area of interest, and I hope I've done enough the warm-up act to excite your interest in this area. And I was talking with Steve in preparing this, and I deluded myself. I said, oh look, I should be able to perhaps get one slide just with a nice diagram of the legal issues of how this fits together before you give a presentation of expertise in this area. And perhaps the next slide will show why I quickly stopped even attempting a diagram, because this is the kind of diagram that you'd end up with, which is everything is just so interconnected that how to get a grasp on it and how to see that is very hard. So the next slide, which we can show, and then flick to the one after that, Jess, so that if you had to do a diagram, it'll look something like that, which wouldn't be helpful at all. But the final slide before I hand over to Steve, I guess I've just put this up because I think it's perhaps a useful reminder or an idea of where some of these issues may come up for lawyers, whether you're with in-house with a resources company, or you're with a law firm, or even a regulator or wherever. So I've had a guess at the situations in which they might arise, and the legal issues that we'll all be grappling with. Clearly, a lot of it will be contract. I expect see a lot more contractual clauses about risk allocation, about dealing with issues of cybersecurity, and we've got some regulation, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see some more on the way, whether it's cybersecurity specific or whether it's just more generally about data management and data regulation, privacy law obligations. And then finally, the area to think about negligence. I guess when any of us clicked on the link for this meeting, did we sort of think, oh, how up to date is our own virus software, and are we going to see this presentation, or are we opening up a hack? So we'll finish sharing those slides there, and I'm very happy to introduce Steve Shupp, who's an executive director with CyberCX, and has had over 2 decades of work in this area of cybersecurity with companies, with government, and much of that, or some of that, in the resources sector as well. So I'm very happy to hand it over to Steve shortly. He'll speak for sort of 30 to 40 minutes. And if you have any questions, please put these in the chat box, and I'll collate and curate them as best I can. We're going to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end to pick up issues of interest to the audience. So with that, very happy to hand over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to a group of interested people in this space. We also feel for all our colleagues on the East Coast in various stages of lockdown and those sorts of issues as well, earthquakes and other events happening. So thank you for taking the time to join us on this call. I was keen through this presentation probably to touch on really 3 key areas. And that's really, what's happening in that sort of threat landscape space. I'd like to kind of delve into a little bit of the anatomy of an attack, and I think sometimes it helps people to have some context around how these sorts of events are unfolding, to give them an understanding of what is our challenge collectively on the cybersecurity side, but also on the company side when dealing with these things. And then I'll have a go at dealing with some of the regulatory and legal and regulatory issues that we see as well. I'm certainly not a trained lawyer, but have been dealing with this from the kind of technical and cybersecurity side for some time. And then, as John said, we'll have some time for some Q&A, which I'd be very happy to address any questions that might come up. As John said, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for quite some time. 20 years ago, we didn't call it cybersecurity, and we actually had one of my colleagues kind of talked to the fact that I was doing cybersecurity before it was cool. I was never unaware that it wasn't cool. I just really enjoyed the work we were doing around originally helping to connect organisations to the internet and then dealing with some of the challenges that brought. Recently, CyberCX was formed. It's about a 2-year-old operation now. But what we've been able to do through CyberCX is bring together the collective power of originally 14 cybersecurity boutique consultancies into a scaled organisation, which Australia really needs this capacity for highly capable sovereign expertise in this space. which we really see as, you know, I guess our vision and our purpose is really to help protect and secure the communities that we work in all around the country. I've got the pleasure of working with a gentleman by the name of Alastair McGibbon, who was once the cybersecurity advisor to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and held some senior roles within government. Alastair often says that, you know, in terms of cybersecurity, we're in a worse state today than we were yesterday, and it's going to be worse tomorrow than it is today. And it really speaks to the fact that this problem with cybersecurity that we're experiencing is ongoing. It really is almost a Cold War that's occurring between the attackers and the organisations that they are attacking. The articles that John showed and the you know, 20 or so articles I just threw up on the screen as well, you know, you would be familiar with the sorts of reporting that's out there and the nature of the organisations that are being, you know, I guess targeted through these, whether they're, you know, whether it's a directed attack or whether they just happen to be victim of some phishing activity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, you know, the problem is growing. You know, we're certainly seeing that there is acceleration. We've seen the kind of ransomware cycle go through, and the ransomware operators are changing their attack methods as well. So we're starting to see what we're calling, you know, sort of a double ransom extortion attack, where not only will they hold data to ransom, but they will also steal data and then extort the organisation, you know, I guess at the threat of releasing that onto the internet if they don't pay the ransoms. And we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, I guess that ecosystem that's occurring within the threat actors and the operators of those networks. But yeah, as I said, you know, it really is something that's accelerating across industry. We'd like to talk about, you know, I guess where these attacks are coming from. You know, often we talk to organisations and they say, well, you know, why would I be a threat? You know, sorry, why would I be a target? You know, why would someone particularly come after my organisation? And I guess there's a variety of responses to that, and a variety of different groups or individuals that might be responsible for those attacks. Certainly when I started in my career, it was more about individuals, you know, and a lot of what we were dealing with was the equivalent of, you know, website defacement, which is like, you know, graffiti artists spray painting walls, but doing it in a digital sense. And those individuals, and we still see individuals these days, but they're probably more at the, you know, kind of exploration, and, you know, it's probably not the bulk of the malicious activity that we're seeing. It's more people that are doing it just out of a sense of curiosity. We've seen hacktivism, and that's where we've got a group of people who are maybe rallying around a particular cause, and then taking their protest to the cyber landscape, you know, and maybe using website defacement or other methods to impact organisations and to progress their cause. Certainly organised crime is a big one these days. And, you know, I think the revenue volumes that they talk about are certainly starting to outweigh those of, you know, maybe drug couriering and those sorts of crimes. And we've seen situations where, you know, gangs that maybe were doing those sorts of physical crimes, you know, drugs and weapons and those sorts of things have moved across to the cyber realm because it's a lot easier to transfer data and personal information and those sorts of things around on the internet than it is to drive, you know, a boot full of drugs across the border and maybe get it to someone else in another place. So, you know, organised crime space. They're generally well funded and highly motivated as well, and that's where we're starting to see that escalation of organised crime, particularly around the phishing and the ransomware side, because having those funds allows them to invest in techniques, tradecraft, and also the underlying infrastructure which they're using to run their crimes from. And I'll touch on that kind of ecosystem that's developing a little bit later. The other big one that we're starting to see is nation state, and you know, cyber is certainly considered a domain of warfare these days, and I think there's some really interesting geopolitics going on as well. You know, Russia certainly hosts a large number of organised crime gangs, and the gentleman's agreement is, well, if you're not doing crimes in Russia, then we'll sort of leave you alone. And as a result, there's certainly a feel in the international community that jurisdictions like Russia could do more to reduce the impact of cybercrime. And whilst they're maybe not necessarily doing it directly out of state-run operations, you know, army or defence, they are certainly kind of aiding and abetting it by turning a blind eye to it. And we've seen recently, you know, Russia has probably started to put a little bit of pressure on some of the gangs that are operating, and that is starting to change some of their approach as well. The sorts of effects that we see that these groups can, I guess, perpetrate against our organisations are fairly common. You know, there's only a certain number of ways that someone can attack a network or you know, cloud environment or an organisation, and we see these sorts of attack methods repeated in different forms across the various incidents that we investigate. So it could be things like unauthorised access, where they've got credentials, could have been through a phishing attack, and then they're using those unauthorised access credentials to gain access and then look at data or applications on the target. Denial of service is one that we have seen. I wouldn't say we see that as much now as we used to, and that typically involves generating a very large amount of traffic and directing that to the target organisation, maybe their website, or maybe a corporate internet access point, which really impedes their ability to do business. Data access is probably a key one around those issues of ransomware and extortion, and being able to gain access to data through, you know, maybe unauthorised access. So kind of chaining those together is quite common. But we've also seen issues where maybe a website has got a vulnerability, or maybe, you know, someone's put some data into a cloud environment and they haven't secured it appropriately. So someone's able to access it because it's publicly accessible. And then moving on to vulnerability exploitation. This is quite common and can typically be combined with other access methods as well. And, you know, towards the end, I talk about some of the things we can do. Certainly organisations understanding what their risk profile is, the sorts of vulnerabilities that they have, and their speed to which they can resolve those vulnerabilities is crucial to be able to secure their organisation. Malware is an interesting one. You know, we kind of see it. In fact, it's probably more prevalent in the mobile space than it really is in you know, the Windows and desktop operating space these days. We certainly still see it in terms of those ransomware attacks. So, you know, an attacker might combine a phishing exercise with some malware, which will drop some ransomware on the system. It might lie dormant, and then at a particular time, it'll be triggered, and then it will encrypt files. So that's kind of a combination of attacks again. And then I've touched on phishing a number of times, and, you know, social engineering is certainly a method that attackers are using in order to identify potential targets. We would see phishing as probably one of the highest used access methods to initiate an attack and to gain access to an organisation, whether that results in credentials that they can use for unauthorised access, or dropping payload through malware to do a crypto attack and those sorts of things. I guess there's a variety of vectors that attackers can use. It could be an attack against our staff. It could be, through that social engineering. And I'll touch on kind of a phishing example and how an attacker might use a method to be able to understand who is in your company and how they might target them. Mobile devices, as I said, particularly with the sorts of apps that people are putting on their phones. And my lights have turned off because I've been still. Just give me a second. There we go. So mobile devices is a common one, and there's a lot of applications that are either put up onto app stores that are malicious in their own right and purport to provide some function or feature to the user, or maybe look very similar to an app that the user's trying to find. And there's certainly been investigations into apps like TikTok, which suggest that there's even capability in that app for the the operator of TikTok to be able to push updates down to that application silently, which might be used for not so good reasons. So, network access is quite a common one too, whether that's Wi-Fi access or even on-premise, and an attacker being physically located on the network and using that to gain access to other resources. Suppliers and partners is probably becoming quite crucial too, and I'll talk about third-party supplier risk as we get down the presentation, and then in some cases physical access. The sorts of impacts that we see as a result of a cyber incident, range from revenue loss and certainly data theft. I would say that those kind of two are probably the primary ones. These days, a lot of cybersecurity incidents, or the motivation of a lot of cybersecurity incidents, is really revenue generated for the attacker. The ability to kind of monetize access or data, and to really chase that as a business model to an extent, has become probably the primary reason that a lot of attacks happen. Certainly there's some evidence of espionage type attacks and gaining data, because that's going to be beneficial in a contract negotiation or those sorts of issues. But I guess a lot of vast majority of the incidents that we see are really around some access to revenue, getting money off an organisation, or data theft. We do and have seen kind of the critical failure, so the impact of the attack might be some failure in a system, or operational disruption, and I guess Colonial is probably the poster child for those sorts of impacts from an incident. What is really interesting about Colonial, however, is that the attack didn't actually reach their operating network. So it was only on the corporate IT side. And I think reading between the lines on some of the media that's come out about that attack, they lost their ability to do billing off the pipeline, and that was because the IT network was shut, or the corporate network was shut down, and they made a decision to stop delivering oil and petroleum products because they weren't able to generate customer billing. So it wasn't actually an attack against their OT network, and wasn't an attack which really disrupted the pipeline itself, but it certainly stopped the business process to be able to understand who'd been delivered products, and then how they were going to bill for those, and that led them to shut down those pipelines. And we're also seeing some issues around regulatory, where an attack might have an impact to the organisation, more from a regulatory point of view. I touched on the criminal ecosystem, and we're definitely seeing a large degree of specialisation. So, you know, in the early days, it was really a gang of people, and that particular gang would do all of the steps required to compromise an environment, gain access, and then some sort of monetisation of that. And then, you know, work with the organisation to get the money from them. But what we're seeing is that there are groups that are specifically geared around different elements of it. So there are access brokers, and what they are doing is basically compromising networks and then selling that compromised access to other groups. That might be selling it to a group that's particularly good at deploying malware. And that might be then sold on to a group that's particularly good at taking that malware, turning that into ransomware and collecting funds. There are other organisations that are particularly good at, you know, the money laundering side or collecting ransom payments and those sorts of things. And it's really getting to the point where ransomware as a service has evolved almost as a business model. And it is possible to purchase a ransomware platform on a lease basis, to the extent that these organisations have got customer support call centres, you know, and they will help you execute your attack, or maybe they'll be the organisation which is taking the calls from the victims to help them, you know, buy a Bitcoin and then transfer the Bitcoin to the right wallet. There was some media recently, and someone had released a bunch of chat logs, and in the chat logs between these call centre agents, someone who was helping with an incident sort of said, you know, hey, how's your day? You know, are you busy? And the ransomware operator said, oh, you wouldn't believe it, I'm dealing with 10 of these at once, and it's just really flat out. So, you know, it's amazing and crazy that this is evolving into, you know, almost a business model in its own right. There was a group called Darkside who were implicated in the Colonial attack, and I think they were very concerned about either becoming drone targets of the US, or maybe someone lent on them pretty heavily in another jurisdiction. And Darkside went away, and an organisation called Black Matter appeared. And Black Matter kind of went through, you know, I guess a bit of a process of understanding what they were doing and the business model that they were in. So when they relaunched, you know, they started to do some things which you really see in large organisations, you know, so they've got an ability to talk to them from a public affairs point of view, and they're open to registrations for organisations who are doing incident recovery to work with them and to facilitate that kind of B2B transaction. They also have a social responsibility statement, which is good. You know, so there's a few organisation types and businesses that they won't attack, or if they accidentally do, you can ask them for free decryption, which, you know, is a nice touch on their part as well. And, you know, every organisation needs to have some value statements, right? So they talk about, you know, value, and obviously one of their very high values there is money. And I heard an interview with someone who purported to be from a gang, and they said, look, at the end of the day, you know, we've got families and we've got kids in school, and we're trying to send them, you know, to private school and all that sort of stuff, right? So, you know, there's real people behind all of this, but quite amazing again that we're seeing this shift to these organisations, you know, almost acting like legitimate companies. So you're probably familiar with kind of social engineering and the sort of phishing attacks that come through. You know, I guess for us, social engineering is all about manipulation of those individuals. And from an email perspective, you know, the typical triggers in a phishing email would be some sort of sense of emotion. There's, you know, they're trying to elicit some sort of emotional response. Possibly there's an unusual request, so you know, click on the link, open the attachment, but some direction to do something. And quite often these days we see a spike in phishing campaigns which is geared around significant public events. You know, COVID late last year was certainly one of those. But, you know, we see other, if there's a humanitarian crisis, for example, we'll see a surge in phishing around, you know, the charity organisations and those sorts of things as well. I think, you know, it's interesting. We do a lot of phishing tests in our business, so we can test an organisation's resilience to phishing. And what it typically identifies is that people don't necessarily have a good grasp on how to identify phishing. Often for a lot of people, it looks obvious, you know, there was poor corporate templates or poor grammar or unusual links, but not everyone is, you know, really good at identifying those sorts of triggers. And we've got a capability where we do some training around that with organisations to improve people's awareness of these. I was keen to kind of step through, you know, how does someone, I guess, turn phishing into money effectively? So there's a bit of a primer. I don't recommend this as a career, but, you know, it's certainly, this is what we're seeing, right? So our attacker there is maybe using a social media platform like LinkedIn, and doing what we call OSINT, or open source intelligence. So they're looking at public available information and identifying targets in the organisation. And those targets might be in accounts payable, or might be the finance officer, or someone who's got a role which would be relevant in the payment path or within the processes in the organisation for transferring money. So given those targets from LinkedIn, they'll craft a phishing email and then they'll send that through to the organisation and hope that they get a click. And our, you know, I guess experience is that we see, you know, anywhere between 30% is probably a benchmark and about average. We've seen as bad as kind of 60%, and in some cases we've seen as good as, you know, 5 or 10% click rates on a well-crafted phishing email. Once the organizer, and then the outcome of that is the attacker wants that person who's clicked on that link to give them credentials. So it might be, it might look like an Office 365 login portal or something like that. So they'll use that fake login portal to gather username and password details so that they can then effectively masquerade inside the organisation, so they can connect to Office 365. And then they're inside the organisation. We've seen situations where the attacker will then use that access to send more phishing emails internally in the organisation to maybe get more targets and effectively more inboxes. We've also seen situations where the attacker might set up forwarding rules with particular keywords so that they can capture email that goes in and out that might be related to invoice payment. So as they kind of gain access into the organisation, they're able to identify the people that are involved in the approval process for invoice payments and those sorts of things. And what they're ultimately going to do is maybe intercept an invoice that's leaving the organisation and update that invoice with their own bank details. Or maybe they'll get into the path between your finance group and a customer, and maybe they'll send an email and say, oh, actually, can we change the bank destination on that invoice? And they'll take some action to redirect the money and collect the funds. So we've seen incidents where, you know, one phishing victim, you know, may turn into 300 internal victims, and maybe multiple clients pay fake invoices until it's identified, and, you know, your accounts receivable department might start ringing people and saying, hey, we haven't seen the payment yet for that invoice. Hang on, we paid that 15 days ago. And then you start to identify that there's been an attack in the organisation. In one situation, we saw $500,000 misdirected over about 49 days. And the general stats on an incident is that it's not identified for anything from 180 to 200 days. So the time to identify that these attacks have been, the organisations a victim of these kinds of attacks can be quite some time in a lot of incidents. I might kind of start touching on some of the legal considerations. It was very interesting to me some months ago. Scott Morrison did a press conference, and he was particularly talking about some cyber incidents that were occurring in Australia, and got very close to naming China as part of that activity. There was enough nuance in there that it wasn't hard to determine who he was talking about. And not too long after that, the federal government released their cybersecurity strategy, which, I think really there's probably two wake-up calls for organisations. One was that nation-state activity that led Scott Morrison to stand in front of the country and talk to the media about the sorts of activity that they were seeing, as a bit of a warning to China that we knew what was happening, but certainly also as a wake-up call to industry to say that federal government is aware of this activity, and we need Australian businesses to be aware of that as well. The FedGov cyber strategy is 1.67 billion investment over 10 years, compared to the previous cyber strategy, which was I think in the order of $400 to $500 million over a period of time. So there's a massive investment that the federal government is making into this space. And this goes as far as funding 500 roles out of defence to operate around, a role of protection and capability for Australia to, I guess, secure our government capability, but also, work with industry on security and probably a more proactive capability than we've had before. Mandatory data breach notification is, something that has been around for a little while now, and everyone's probably familiar with, I guess, the requirements on that. I think for me, for a long time in Australia, we looked to, other places, the US and Europe, and we kind of thought, gee, we wouldn't want to be over there with the sorts of incidents that they're having and the sorts of attacks they're experiencing. And I think for me, mandatory data breach notification really started to uncover the depth of the problem that we have in Australia, and really started to shine a light into the sorts of incidents that companies were experiencing. So, I think it's a good net result around just raising awareness on the sorts of impacts that are occurring, and I think that has really given Australian organisations an understanding of issues that they need to be aware of, and the sorts of threats that they need to be dealing with. Our advice around mandatory data breach is, it's really important to understand where your personal identification information might be stored in the environment. And crucially, if you look at the sorts of capability that OAAC expect you to have, is an incident response plan. It needs to be defined and tested. Particularly, you need to have a breach assessment process. So an ability to understand if there was a data breach, how would you determine if that breach constituted a breach which would likely have harm to an individual. And then also we recommend having a notification plan, which includes notifying the OAAC, but importantly notifying the individuals that may have been implicated in that incident. Just recently, OAAC made some commentary on ransomware, and that quote there, that it's insufficient for an entity to rely on the absence of evidence of access to or exfiltration of data to conclusively determine that an eligible data breach has occurred. And what they're really saying there is we investigate situations where we can positively identify that an organisation has been breached. It is sometimes difficult to identify where the data has been taken from the environment. So back to the phishing example, we can tell that a mailbox on Office 365 has been accessed, for example, from Russia, but it's not necessarily possible to tell every single email that was opened or the attachments that were looked at. And if there was PII, so it was a HR mailbox or something like that, what the OIC is saying is you can't necessarily rely on the fact that you can't tell positively yes or no whether the data was moved to determine whether it's not a breach that's reportable. So, you know, it's kind of really crucial there to understand the direction from OIC.
Got about 5 minutes, Steve.
Thank you. Third-party supplier risk is something that we're certainly seeing accelerate these days as well. There's a lot of, you know, kind of B2B that's going on, you know, whether it's around data sharing or service providers. And what we're seeing is a much greater requirement, you know, I guess through tendering processes for federal government or state governments. And certainly we've got a lot of clients who are working with large organisations and they're needing to be able to comply with a cybersecurity assessment and I guess demonstrate what their capability around cybersecurity is. And I think our advice on this one is, you know, take a risk-based approach. So if you are the organisation who is sending out questionnaires and surveying your supplier base, start to understand, you know, which of your suppliers represents the greatest risk to your organisation from a data perspective. Be realistic in questionnaires. We've seen, you know, probably a good questionnaire is around sort of 20 or so key questions to identify the maturity of that organisation. We've seen unrealistic questionnaires that are in the kind of 200 question range, which, you know, really becomes unwieldy for the supplier to be able to respond to effectively. And we think that there's a lot of opportunity here for automation and data analysis. So using tools to be able to send out the questionnaires and collect responses and then analyse what those responses means in terms of your risk with your suppliers. John mentioned security of critical infrastructure, and there's a bill coming up which, you know, is really changing, I guess, the scope of the SOCI Act. At the moment, the SOCI Act is really geared around utility sector to be, you know, I guess from an industry point of view. But you can see there from that kind of wheel that the number of organisations and the industries that are going to be pulled into this requirement is absolutely expanding. And it's really around this concept of protecting the essential services that Australians rely on. You know, so if you look around that wheel, you know, food and grocery, right, you know, we would expect that, you know, Coles and Woolworths become a critical infrastructure provider. And then if you look at things like data and cloud and communications, you're starting to include telcos and you're starting to include cloud services, you know, even education, research and innovation. So, you know, the university sector, for example, will start to fall into this requirement. As part of the bill, there's a need to report information to a register of critical assets, critical infrastructure assets. And there starts to become some obligations. So in the early stages, there'll be some positive security obligations around, for example, reporting incidents within appropriate timeframes, which can be as short as 12 hours from identification of the incident, and then with a further 72-hour timeframe to be able to provide a compliant report against a particular template to government, and a need to maintain a risk management program for that asset to define, you know, the sorts of risks and controls that you're using to protect it. Systems that are identified of national significance then become part of an enhanced security obligation, which includes things like maintaining an incident response plan, conducting cyber incident exercises, maintaining vulnerability assessment, and providing access to system information. So more detailed understanding to government of, you know, what that system is made up of, for their register. And the government assistance one is particularly interesting because I guess the way they talk about it in the bill is for the government to be able to provide assistance to an organisation that suffered a breach. If you read in detail, it actually provides them a capability to come onto that organisation and to work with them proactively in terms of dropping people onto the network or dropping capability onto the network in the event that there was a very large cyber incident. John, that's probably a good point for me to pick up some Q&A if you have some. There's a couple of things I've got in closing, but I'm happy, based on time frame, just to kind of skip over those at this point. We can provide those as a PDF.
One that came earlier, and I think you've probably answered it, but it might just be useful to really hit it again, was asking whether there are minimal industry standards or sort of the level of protection that a company should have. And I guess listening to your presentation, we're seeing some stuff in that critical infrastructure bill. So there's what you should have in place, but a lot of it also seems to be a notification obligation once you're aware things have gone wrong.
Yeah, look, I would say that a lot of industry regulation is moving around the ISO 27001 standard as the baseline for assessing and determining maturity of an organisation's security capability and posture. So ISO 27001 is an information security management standard, and it defines a whole bunch of domains that allow an organisation to comprehensively ensure that they've got security implemented. So I'd suggest that that is probably the highlight standard that people would be using. There are a bunch of frameworks like NIST that we're seeing, and depending on the regulatory authority, like APRA, for example, heading I think in a NIST approach. Some of the state governments are using 27001 as their approach. To an extent, if you're working with 27001, then you would be able to use that to comply with other industry regulation.
Sure. Can you just unpack NIST for the audience?
So NIST is a framework originally out of the US, and really is probably more of a technical guidance on the sorts of controls that need to be in place. So there's quite a large document which provides particular guidelines around cloud, for example, or on-premise and data centers, and gets down into the nuts and bolts of how you might do authentication and how you might do encryption and how you might do access control and on all those sorts of elements.
Okay, thanks. Another question is, do you have any familiarity of insurance in this space? Are people sort of just trying to get insurance and saying, well, that'll look after it, or how the market's reacting?
Yeah, the insurance space is very interesting at the moment. The director for our digital forensics and incident response group has had quite a long engagement with insurance companies as a responder to incidents for their insured. I think what Nick has seen is that the insurance companies have had a hard time matching the kind of premiums with the sorts of risk and cost that they might see on an incident. We've seen, organisations paying $3,000 for coverage and then having multi-million-dollar claims. The other thing that I think the insurance industry is grappling with at the moment is the ransomware industry which has occurred really is preying on the fact that there is insurance coverage and that they're using that as a mechanism to get money, basically. So we expect that cyber insurance, the nature of cyber insurance is going to change. Insurers may start to take cyber insurance coverage out of policies. We also, I think it's one of those moving spaces, and it's not necessarily going to be one that you can just insure away and hope for the best. And even in some of the policies, we're starting to see that you need to have taken a minimum level of steps and controls in order to qualify. And that's, to use a car analogy, right? If you run the car into a tree and you have bald tyres, maybe you're not going to get coverage because you didn't maintain the car properly.
Yeah. Well, that probably leads on usefully to the next question, and disclosure to the audience. This is a Dorothy Dixer. So looking at the resources sector, so I guess you were saying there, look, if you just haven't done the obvious basics, perhaps you might not get coverage. What in the resources sector do you think are sort of key areas that you think this might be the areas where there's most vulnerability? Is it in the field? Is it head office? Is it service providers? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that in resources.
Yeah, look, again, it's an evolving space. So some of the resource organisations that we work with are probably among the highest level of maturity, but there's certainly the very large, well-known brands who can afford to spend, a great deal of money on protecting projects that are, obviously a great deal of money to run. I think that there's some things that can be done by any organisation, and we're starting to see that roll out. So things like multi-factor authentication is a massive treatment against phishing attacks and those sorts of issues. Vulnerability management programs are crucial, and then having an ability to monitor and detect an attack and then respond to it in a timely manner. I think what we're seeing is among the organisations that are quite mature, they're now starting to look at their operating environments, so their OT technology environment, and they're starting to look at the risks, and there goes the light again, at the risks that they're having, and how they're addressing those. So, I think Alistair McGibbon kind of gives Australia probably a C- in terms of security capability and maturity across the country. So there's a lot that we can do. Obviously, in every industry, there's going to be examples who are quite mature and quite capable, and there's going to be a large amount of organisations that could do a lot of work.
Yeah, no problems. Well, the next question, while you're getting that, I guess I read somewhere one of the interesting areas is to some degree the legacy. So you've got old material that just the mere fact that it could be controlled remotely was all that was put in place. And I guess that the reason for one of those opening slides, I think it was a BHP truck, and that was not a cyber incident, but it I guess shows the vulnerability of the potential for things that could go wrong in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done some direct penetration testing on autonomous vehicles, and I think our team were able to get to a point where they could move a haul pack forward remotely without authentication, and it took them about 6 hours to get there. So that was pretty eye-opening for the client in that situation. We're having a conversation with another mining organisation, and their OT person was adamant that there was no interconnect between their OT environment and the rest of the network, and then was proudly telling us that they can operate mine sites from 2,000 kilometres away. So there's a lot of networking and IT that goes on in order to be able to do those sorts of activities. And that's certainly where we're starting to see, I guess, the more mature organisations focus on how they maintain that availability and integrity on those systems.
Yeah, and so there's the OT, there's the technical side. On the legal side, I mean, if you've dealt with lawyers, what are there sort of things you just think, bloody hell, I just wish this issue were understood a bit better? I mean, what do you think, if you've got a minute now to say to lawyers, this is one thing you really should perhaps try and reframe or understand? What would that be? We'll close off with that.
Probably a couple of points. One would be authorization to us is really crucial. So a lot of what, particularly in our penetration testing group, a lot of what they do is actually considered a crime under the Criminal Act, under cyber crimes, unless it is done with authorization. So contractually, we talk a lot about, and a lot to lawyers in our in our customer organisations, because we're quite particular about getting appropriate authorizations to do the work that we do. And the important part of that is not so much authorization from the client that we're dealing with, but from third parties that they might be using. So if you've got an IT environment that is hosted, we need you to gain authorization from the hosting provider, for example. So that would be one crucial one. I think the other one that we sort of run up against is around intellectual property. And for us, our methodology is our IP. And it's not necessarily a lot of IP, I guess, terms and conditions. We start to run into this discussion around, is our methodology of the benefit to the client, or is the output and the delivered material the benefit? And I guess the awareness that I would like people to have is that we will provide you a report, and that report will give you clearly understanding, of where you've got vulnerabilities or issues. How we arrive at that, our methodology IP on how we identify vulnerabilities and test them and validate that they're there, isn't necessarily IP that the organisation needs to own, the client organisation needs to own. And obviously it's the report output that is the crucial part.
Sure. No, I completely understand. Look, thank you very much, Steve. It's just been an excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. And people will see up on the slide at the moment the contact details for ER Law if you're interested in joining the organisation. Steve's details are up there, and his slides will be made available after this presentation. And if you have any complaints about the Warm-Up Act or my slides, you can contact me there. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe. Take care. Thanks all.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.